And that brings me on to our second trend that we've been tracking, and I know all of us here uh, enjoy looking at counter trends. We like to look at, when there are trends in visual communication, what else is emerging in spite of that trend. So for AI, we as we've already discussed, we've seen a certain type of imagery that's being used to specifically talk about AI, but we're also looking at how brands are talking about the opposite of AI. So really thinking about humans and human relationships and human creativity, and how that might be visualized not only in terms of what we're looking at, but also in terms of the aesthetics that are used to talk about that. And the most obvious thing, although perhaps not the most obvious, is that we've seen a lot of technology images where people are using technology, whether that's a laptop, whether that's a desktop, whether it's a tablet or a mobile phone, is that there's a much more focus in on just the hands. And for years and years and years, we've seen the trend going the opposite direction, where you see the person, you see the life that they lead, and how technology fits into that. But now we're seeing the kind of visual technique of using the hand specifically to talk about a human using technology, and that's really interesting because not only is it representing people in all of their diversity, but it's also using the visuals that we know that AI doesn't get right all of the time. So I think most people are aware that AI generated content struggles with hands. Now it's getting a lot better. We've seen that happen over 2024. But actually, really beautiful hands are very much the realm of photography. And so as a result, we've seen much more focus on the hands within the imagery. So that's been a really interesting kind of development that we've seen, and again, we expect that to continue into 2025. The other thing, and we talked about color, we've talked about the kind of the aesthetics of AI and the aesthetics of technology, and within that we see this very blue, bright blue technological color being used. And if anyone's interested in kind of color psychology and the color wheel has its opposite colors, and the opposite color to the blues and moving into the bright greens is orange and yellow, and especially orange and kind of golden yellows. And so what we have seen as a result of one type of imagery going off in one direction, we've seen another type of imagery emerging, especially around lifestyle and business imagery. And every year we look at our top sellers, our most popular downloaded images, especially around men and women, and we've been tracking those for many years now. And it's really interesting how the top selling images of 2024, both for men and women, were people in this color palette, wearing clothing, being styled in the kind of the orange and yellow hue. Previous years, blue had been dominating, especially in the top selling men over that time. So that's really fascinating, and I think in each region we've seen how this is kind of developing slightly differently. And I'm going to go to you, Jackie, first, because I know even within your region there are some differences.
Absolutely. And I'd say, while there's differences in how the color palettes are showing up in the visuals that customers are engaging with across the region, I will say though that the emotion and the feeling is very much about warmth, about welcoming, and about empathy. So if we think about Europe, Rebecca, to what you just said, it is very vibrant. We are massively seen in lifestyle and business imagery. It's about the warm and fuzzy. It's about the sunbursts of gold. It's about the cozy knits. It's about the dynamic oranges. The other secondary trend that we're seeing as a predominant palette in Europe, and I do put my hand up with my bias as an Irish person coming up to St. Patrick's Day looking at it, but we are seeing a lot of luscious emeralds and greens and khakis, and then the little gentler sage greens. And it's often, you see a lot more tactility within the images. And for all the plant lovers out there, plants are definitely a character that are coming into their own across all those visuals. We're seeing, much more growth, abundance. They're not landscaped and well kept. They're growing, they're engulfing and enveloping characters, human characters within the visual stories. That's Europe. When we look at the Middle East, it's a little different. There's a delicateness, there's a gentleness. We're seeing a little bit of rise around linens. We're seeing kind of light stone patterns on the walls. If we look at that lifestyle or business imagery, we're seeing a little bit more like little pieces of light colored browns coming through on the furniture. Now, I will say with the traditional dress that often dominates a lot of the visuals that are popular within these regions, you do get the whites and the blacks for UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. However, you also see that for non traditional dress within these pictures, it's often the calm grays, it's quite muted. So, again, a lot of nature, just very kind of connection with nature is coming through in both, all across the region. But what I will say, where we're beginning to see an interesting growth on color patterns that's changing, is really down to the rise of what I would call the dark beiges, the browns, the shiny fabrics like the bronzes that are being reflective, and then they're juxtaposed against some of that more kind of darker woolens. That's the maca, the coffee colors, and so on. And again, I think a lot of this is less about, we roll back a couple of years ago about the sense of hygge, that comforting, cocooning. And it's actually more about exploring. There's a little bit more density and textures to it. And I think there's a lot more nuances where you can have these richness of storytelling happening about around human-centered relationships within the visuals.
So for APAC, we're seeing tonally very similar to what we're seeing from the global standpoint. So the warmth of the oranges and the yellows are definitely coming through, but I would say with the exception of Japan. What's really interesting is in Japan, we have seen that shift away from the previously kind of darker electric blues, and definitely the trend is moving more towards lighter, whiter, and kind of area blues to really give that sense of optimism, or at least trying to instill more optimism and calmness in the tech visuals. And a little bit to what Jacqueline was saying on the previous side around a lot of the anxiety that is happening around AI. I think that's definitely starting to show through in what we're seeing for Japan. So very much a desire to promote more calmness, especially because when we carried out the survey results that we did through Visual GPS, was actually a lot of people in Japan are finding it difficult to keep pace with today's rapidly changing world. So again, I definitely think we're going to see more warmth for sure, but I equally think we're going to see more simplicity in the visuals that we see. So ones that share more calmness around them rather than the busy, often frenetic visuals that we tend to see.
I think rounding out with the Americas, we're having sort of a similar evolution to Europe, particularly in addition to those yellow tones, those yellows and oranges that Rebecca had mentioned. We're also seeing more of the greens, these rich greens, as well as browns and earthier tones. It's almost like we're planting our feet firmly in the ground in nature. And I think something specifically that's also emerging, which is really, really fascinating, are the different ways that brands in this part of the world are trying to sort of bring that warmth forward, whether it's through the humans or the objects that are at the center. You're showing that warmth where through the styling of that particular image, where they are happening within the home. You're seeing that in the sort of particularly in the way the image is composed and sort of constructed. You have that person or that figure or those objects in the foreground that have those color palette, that warmer color palette, and it's shown in that frame front and center. And there's also this other interesting way that they're showing this warmth, which is not just through color palette, but through sort of lighting, and the ways in which, the use of light, either natural or artificial, is evoking warmth. And I'm not talking about sun flares. It's really about these bright, clean, cooler tone visuals that sort of use natural light to draw your eye to the person at the center. And with the rise of inclusion of people, even with darker skin, brown skin tones, you're really seeing them show that light in this, have this kind of sun dappling and really letting their skin tone shine in that particular image, which I think is really powerful for this part of the world.